Chapter 100 of The Story of the Greeks. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wilfred. The Story of the Greeks by H.A. GUERBER. Death of Darius. Alexander soon won the goodwill of the Babylonians by allowing them to rebuild the Temple of Bel, which had been destroyed. He also secured the affections of the captive Jews, for he excused them from doing any work on this building as soon as he heard that they considered it the Tower of Babel, and hence objected to aiding in its erection. The young conqueror spent 1 month in Babylon, and then went on to Susa. There he found the brazen statue of Athene, which Xerxes had carried off to Persia, and he sent it back to the Athenians, who received it with much joy. The Persian queen now became very ill, and, in spite of the utmost care, she soon died. Throughout her illness, Alexander was most thoughtful and attentive, and when she died, he gave orders that she should be buried with all the pomp due to her high rank. He also comforted the mourning Sisygambis, and sent the news of the queen's death to Darius, who had fled to the northern part of his kingdom, where he was hastily gathering together another army. Touched by Alexander's conduct, Darius now wrote to him, offering peace, and proposing to share the throne of Persia with him. The young conqueror's head had been turned by many victories, and he was growing more haughty every day. So he proudly refused this proposal, saying that the world could not have 2 masters any more than 2 sons. In his pride, Alexander now assumed the dress and state of an oriental king, surrounded himself with luxury, and spent most of his time in feasting and revelry. His courtiers encouraged him in this folly, and he soon forgot the wise lessons taught by Aristotle. On several occasions, the young king drank so much that he did not know what he was doing, and once, in a fit of drunken rage, he set fire to the beautiful palace of Persepolis and burnt it to the ground. As he had refused Darius' offers of peace, he soon considered it necessary to continue the war. So, laying aside his jeweled robes, he put on his armor and set out for the north. He was about to overtake the Persian king when Darius was mortally wounded by one of his followers named Bessus. The traitor thought that he would win Alexander's favor by his crime, and came and boasted of it to him. Alexander was so angry, however, that he bade his guards seize Bessus, and had him put to death in the most barbarous way. When the Macedonian king finally came up with Darius, he found him bathed in his own blood, and breathing his last. He had only time to assure him of the safety of his family, and to promise to continue to protect them, before Darius sank back, dead. By Alexander's orders, the body was embalmed and carried to Sisygambis, so that it could be properly buried in the beautiful tomb of the Persian kings. This last act of generosity quite won the aged queen's heart, and she felt so grateful that she loved Alexander as long as he lived. End of chapter 100. Chapter 100 of The Story of the Greeks. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wilfred. The Story of the Greeks by H.A. GUERBER. Defeat of Porus. Now that Darius was dead, Alexander took the Persian title of Shah-in-Shah, King of Kings, and became ruler of all the empire which had been subject to the Persian monarch. He was so proud of his new state and of his vast conquests that he entirely forgot that he owed them mostly to his brave generals and soldiers, and he became so obstinate that he would no longer listen to any advice and only thought of having his own way. His father general, Parmenio, who had always given him the wisest counsel, was no longer in favor, because he tried to restrain the king's extravagance. Indeed, Alexander's once generous and noble nature was so changed that, when his courtiers accused Parmenio of treachery, he listened to them and actually put the faithful general to death. Every day now, Alexander indulged in feasts and banquets, always drinking more and more, although it was affecting his health as well as his temper. Clytus, the son of his old nurse, tried to check his excesses, but only succeeded in provoking his wrath. On one occasion, such remonstrances so enraged Alexander that in his drunken fury he seized a spear and killed Clytus. When he saw him dead at his feet, the king realized what a terrible crime he had committed, and felt deep remorse for a short time. He reformed and, instead of giving himself up entirely to pleasure, spent the next 2 years in the work of governing Persia, where he founded several cities called by his name. As all the central part of Asia now acknowledged his rule, he next went down to India, where he found King Porus, the bravest adversary he had ever met. This king, whose realm was in the northwestern part of India, came against Alexander with a very large army. In the ranks were many elephants, trained to crush the enemy beneath their huge feet, and bearing on their broad backs wooden turrets filled with brave fighting men and good archers. In spite of these elephants, which at first awakened great fear in the Greek soldiers, the Macedonian phalanx won the victory as usual, and Porus was made prisoner. He was led into the presence of Alexander, who haughtily asked him how he expected to be treated. "Like a king," was the proud reply. This answer so pleased Alexander that it not only set Porus free, but even allowed him to keep his kingdom, after he had sworn to be the faithful subject of his conqueror. Alexander, having thus won the help and affection of Porus, made war against several other Indian kings, and continued his advance towards the south. In one of these battles he lost his faithful steed Bucephalus, which had borne him safely through many a fight. Alexander felt this loss deeply, and not only had a monument built over his remains, but also founded a city nearby, which was called Bucephala. End of chapter 101. Chapter 102 of The Story of the Greeks. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wilfred. The Story of the Greeks by H.A. GUERBER. The Return to Babylon. Upon reaching the Ipsus River, Alexander would have liked to cross it and continue his conquests, but his soldiers now refused to go any farther. They were tired of fighting and danger, and were longing to go back to Macedon. Although he was unwilling to do so, Alexander was therefore obliged to stop in his conquests. But, instead of going home as he had come, he now built a fleet and sailed down the Indus River to the sea. Now, the Greeks had no maps such as we have, and their knowledge of geography was very small. When Alexander came to the sea, however, he thought it must be the same as that into which the Euphrates flowed. To find out if it was true, he bade his admiral, Nearchus, sail along the coast and explore it, while the army went homeward on foot. Alexander himself stayed with the army, and led the soldiers along a new way, which was very wearisome and dangerous. The Macedonians had to pass through the large wastes of burning sand, where they suffered a great deal. They were cheered and encouraged, however, by the example of Alexander, who nobly shared their hardships, and always went ahead of them on foot, carrying his own armor. Once, when they were panting with thirst, some of his men found a little water, which they brought him. Rather than indulge in anything which all could not share with him, Alexander poured the water out upon the sand, saying he would refresh himself only when his men could do so too. After many months of weary travel and great suffering, the army finally joined the fleet at the mouth of the Euphrates, for Nearchus had in the meanwhile sailed all along the northern coast of the Indian Ocean and up the Persian Gulf. He wrote an account of his wonderful sea journey, which was of great importance, as it opened a new and convenient road for eastern commerce. The people soon took advantage of it to establish colonies and trading stations, and to carry on a lively business with the East. End of chapter 102.
Chapter 103 of the Story of the Greeks. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Scott Reynolds. www.ScottReyonoldsVoice.com. The Story of the Greeks by H.A. GUERBER. Death of Alexander the Great. Alexander now went back to Babylon, where he married Roxana, a Persian princess, giving her sister's hand to his intimate friend Hephaestion. This wedding was celebrated with great pomp, for 80 Macedonian officers took Persian wives on the same day. The feasting for the weddings went on for many days, and the revelry was carried to such a shameful excess that Hephaestion actually drank himself to death. In token of sorrow, Alexander built him a fine tomb, had him buried with all the magnificence possible, and even decreed that he should henceforth be worshipped as a god. In this folly he was upheld by the priests, who were now ready to grant his every wish, and were always filling his mind with their senseless flatteries. Alexander fell into his old habits more than ever. He had again assumed all the pomp of an Eastern king, and sat down on a wonderful golden throne. Over his head was the golden vine that had formerly belonged to the first Darius. Its leaves were of emeralds, while its grapes were clusters of fine carbuncles. This vine had been given to a Persian king by Croesus, the wealthy ruler of Lydia, and was considered one of the most precious treasures which the young conqueror had won. But in spite of all Alexander's successes, he was not nearly so happy as he used to be when only king of Macedon. He no longer enjoyed the fine health which had helped him to bear the greatest hardships, and weakened by overeating and drinking, he soon fell dangerously ill. The doctors crowded round his bed, doing their best to save him, but they soon saw that he would die. When the Macedonian soldiers heard this, they were beside themselves with grief, and one and all insisted upon seeing their beloved leader once more. Silently and sadly they filed past his bed, gazing upon the dying face which they had seen so bright and full of life a short time before. As most of the soldiers were older than their king, they had never expected to outlive him, and everyone said that it was sad to die, thus, at age 33, when master of nearly all the known world. Just before he died, someone begged Alexander to name his successor. He hesitated for a moment, then drew his signet ring from his finger, gave it to Perdiccas, his principal general, and whispered that the strongest among them should have the throne. Alexander's death was mourned by all, for in spite of his folly and excesses, he was generally beloved. Even Sisygambis, the Persian queen whom he had taken captive a few years before, shed many tears over his remains, and declared she had lost a protector who had always treated her as kindly as if he had been her own son. The conqueror's body was laid in a golden coffin and carried in state to Alexandria, the city he had founded at the mouth of the Nile. Here a fine tomb was built by order of Ptolemy, one of Alexander's generals, who said that the dead master also should be worshipped as a god. Ptolemy wanted the body to remain in Egypt because an oracle had said that he who buried Alexander would be master of his kingdom. End of Death of Alexander the Great. Recording by Scott Reynolds. www.ScottReyonoldsVoice.com.
Chapter 104 of The Story of the Greeks. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wilfred. The Story of the Greeks by H.A. GUERBER. The Division of the Realm. The day after Alexander's death, there was a sad assembly in the palace. All the Macedonian generals sat there in silence and dismay, gazing at the empty golden throne upon which Perdiccas had solemnly laid the royal signet ring. Who was to take the place of the king, whose military genius and great conquests had won for him the title of Great? It is true that Alexander had a half-brother named Arrhidaeus, but he was weak-minded. The only other heir was an infant son, born shortly after his father's death. The generals gravely talked the matter over, and finally said that Arrhidaeus and the child should be publicly named successors of the dead king, while 4 of their own number should be appointed guardians of the princes and regents of the vast realm. This decision was considered wise, and the kingdom of Alexander was divided into 33 provinces, each governed by a Macedonian officer, who was to hold it in the name of Arrhidaeus and of the child. In dying, Alexander had foretold that his funeral would be followed by bloodshed, and his predictions came true. The generals, who had met so solemnly around the empty throne, soon became dissatisfied at being only governors, and each wanted to be king in his own right of the land entrusted to his care. Perdiccas, having received Alexander's signet ring from his dying hand, was, of course, their leader, and took under his own protection the infant king and the Persian mother Roxana. He fancied that it would thus be an easy matter to keep the power in his own hands, and to govern the vast realm as he pleased. But Antipater, governor of Macedon, no sooner heard that Alexander was dead than he placed the idiot Arrhidaeus on the throne, proclaimed him king, and began to rule as if he were the only regent. The other Macedonian generals daily claimed new rights, which Perdiccas was forced to grant in order to pacify them, but when it was too late, he found out how mistaken he had been, and regretted that he had yielded to their demands. The various governors, never satisfied with the honors given them, were not only suspicious of each other, but particularly jealous of Perdiccas, the head of the realm. In their envy, they rose up against him, and for many years Perdiccas was forced to hold his own against them all, while trying to make his way back to Macedon, where he wanted to place Alexander's son upon the throne. End of chapter 104.
Chapter 105 of The Story of the Greeks. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wizardry Wand. The Story of the Greeks by H.A. GUERBER. Death of Demosthenes. When Alexander left for the east, the orator Demosthenes began to urge the Greeks to rise up against him and win back their freedom. All his eloquence, however, was not enough to persuade them to make war as long as Alexander lived. But when the conqueror's death was made known, Demosthenes again tried to arouse them, and this time with success. Phocion, a cautious Athenian, vainly begged the people to wait at least until the news was confirmed, saying, If Alexander is dead today, he will still be dead tomorrow and on the next day, so that we may take counsel at our leisure." This wise caution, however, did not suit the Athenians, who were joined in their revolt by most of the little states and principal towns of Greece, except Sparta. The united Greeks soon raised an army which marched northward and met the Macedonian governor's troops near Thermopylae. The Greeks were successful here, and after shutting up the enemy in the fortress of Lamia, closely besieged them. But after a time, the Greek general was killed, and when the Macedonians were reinforced, they gained a decisive victory. This really ended the war, for the Macedonian general Antipater broke up the union and made separate terms of peace for each city. In his anger, Antipater said he would punish all those who had encouraged the Greeks to revolt. He soon learned that Demosthenes had been one of the principal men to advise the uprising, so he sent his soldiers to make him prisoner. Demosthenes, warned of his danger, immediately fled, but had only time to take refuge in the temple of Neptune. There, in spite of the holiness of the place, Antipater's guards came to get him. Seeing that it would be useless to resist, the orator asked for a few moments' respite, that he might write a letter to his friends. The men consented, and Demosthenes, closely watched, took up his tablet and a reed with which he generally wrote. The soldiers saw him trace a few lines, then stop and bite the top of his reed, as if thinking about what he would say next. But instead of going on to write his letter, the orator soon covered his head with his cloak and stayed quite still. After a moment's waiting, one of the men went to him, and, receiving no answer to his question, drew aside the folds of the cloak. He started back in terror, for the orator's face was very pale, and he was evidently about to die. The men quickly carried him out of the temple, so that it should not be defiled by death, and then they found that the reed with which he wrote was hollow, and had contained a deadly drug. Demosthenes had taken the poison, thinking that death would be better than prison. The Athenians now saw that it would have been wiser to listen to the cautious Phocion, so they set him at the head of their affairs, and promised to obey him. Although honest, Phocion was not very clever, and his caution, little by little, became cowardice. In his fear of the Macedonians, he allowed them to have more and more power, and Greece, a few years later, was entirely under the rule of Antipater, the Macedonian governor. End of The Death of Demosthenes. Recording by Wizardry Wand. Chapter 106 of the Story of the Greeks. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wizardry Wand. The Story of the Greeks by H.A. GUERBER. The Last of the Athenians. Antipater, although master of all Greece, did not treat the people cruelly, for he was very anxious to secure friends who would help him to keep his share of Alexander's realm. He soon heard that Perdiccas was marching homeward with the infant king, who was named, like his father, Alexander, and he knew that the general wanted to place the child on the Macedonian throne. This plan was very distasteful to Antipater. He was not at all afraid of the infant Alexander, but he knew that Perdiccas would want to be regent, and he wished that position himself. Rather than give up his authority, Antipater decided to fight, and, as many of Alexander's generals were dissatisfied, they all rose up in arms at the same time, as we have seen. Perdiccas was surrounded by enemies, but he faced them all bravely, and even led an army into Egypt to subdue Ptolemy, his greatest foe. To reach the enemy, the soldiers under Perdiccas were obliged to swim across the Nile. Here so many of them were eaten up by huge crocodiles that the rest, angry with their general for leading them into such danger, fell upon him and killed him. Almost at the same time, Antipater died, leaving his son Cassander and his general Polysperchon to quarrel over the government of Macedon. Each gathered together an army and tried to get as many friends as possible, especially among the Greeks. The Athenians vainly tried to remain neutral during this quarrel, but in the course of the war, Polysperchon came into their city, said that Phocion and many other great citizens were siding with Cassander, and condemned them to die by drinking poison brewed from the hemlock plant. It seems, however, that there was not enough poison ready to kill them all, so the jailer made Phocion give him some money to buy more. The noble old man, forced to do as he was bidden, gave the necessary amount, saying, "It seems that one cannot even die for nothing in Athens." As he was the last really noted politician in the city, he has been called the last of the Athenians. No one ever dared to uphold the city's power after his death, or try to help it win back its old freedom. As soon as Perdiccas was dead, Roxana and his son were brought to Macedon, where they were finally placed under the protection of Polysperchon. When Olympias, the mother of Alexander the Great, saw his infant son, she was so anxious to secure the throne for him alone that she slew the idiot king Aridaeus and all his family. Under pretext of avenging this crime, Cassander captured and slew Olympias, and then, having won Macedon and Greece from Polysperchon, and seeing that there was no one left to protect Roxana and the child king, he put both mother and son in prison, where they were killed by his order shortly after. Thus, 12 years after Alexander's death, all his family were dead, and his vast kingdom was a prey to quarreling, which broke it up into several states. End of The Last of the Athenians. Recording by Wizardry Wand.
Chapter 107 of The Story of the Greeks. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James Simenc. The Story of the Greeks by H.A. Gerber. Chapter 107. The Colossus of Rhodes. When Perdiccas died, Antigonus the One-Eyed was named his successor, and became governor of all the eastern province. He no sooner heard that Cassander had murdered Alexander's family than he marched westward, intending to avenge the crime. On his way, Antigonus passed through Syria, the land governed by Seleucus, and asked that ruler how he had spent the money of the kingdom. Seleucus, who had a bad conscience, instead of answering, ran away to Egypt, where he became a friend of Ptolemy. Then, fearing that they would not be able to fight against Antigonus successfully, these two generals persuaded Cassander, ruler of Macedon, and Lysimachus, ruler of Thrace, to join them. For several years the war was kept up between the four allies on one side and Antigonus and his son Demetrius on the other. The field of battle was principally in Asia Minor. The fighting continued until the generals became weary of warfare and concluded to make peace. A treaty was then signed, settling the claims of all parties and providing that all the Greek cities should have their freedom. This done, each went back to his own province. But it soon became evident that the peace would not last, for Cassander did not keep his promise to make the Greek states free. When Cassander's wrongdoing became known, the generals called upon Demetrius to bring him to terms. The Athenians were so pleased when they heard of this that they received Demetrius with great joy. Demetrius was such a good general that he soon managed to defeat Cassander at Thermopylae, and when he came back to Athens in triumph, the happy people gave him the title of the Preserver, called a month by his name, lodged him in the Parthenon, and worshipped him as a god. Some time after this, Demetrius conquered Ptolemy, who had shown that he would not abide by the treaty either. This victory was so great that Demetrius's soldiers said he deserved a reward and named him king of Syria. When the other generals heard that Demetrius and his father had accepted the title of kings, they too put on royal crowns. Then, as each was still jealous of the rest and wished to obtain more land for himself, war soon broke out among them once more. Demetrius, who had been very lucky in all his wars, now planned to take the island of Rhodes from Ptolemy, king of Egypt. It proved, however, a far more difficult thing than he had expected, and after besieging the principal city for a whole year, he gave up the attempt. But he had invested so many machines to try to subdue the city of Rhodes that everyone thought he deserved much credit, and they therefore gave him the title of Poliorcetes, the city-taker. Peace was agreed upon, and Demetrius retreated, giving up to the Rhodians all the mighty war engines he had brought with him. These were sold for 300 talents, something over $300,000, and the money thus obtained was used in erecting a colossal statue in honor of Apollo, or Helios, the patron god of the island. This marvelous brazen statue, which was so fine that it was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, represented the sun god, with his head surrounded by rays and with his feet resting one on each side of the entrance of the port. We are told that the Colossus of Rhodes, as this statue was generally called, was so tall that ships under full sail easily passed under its spreading legs, in and out of the harbor. It stood there for about 60 years when it was overthrown by an earthquake. After lying in ruins for a long time, the brass was sold as old metal. It was carried off on the backs of camels, and we are told that 900 of these animals were required for the work. Thus vanished one of the much-talked-of wonders of the ancient world. The others were Diana's temple at Ephesus, the tomb of Mausolus, which was so fine that any handsome tomb is sometimes called a mausoleum, the Pharos or lighthouse of Alexandria or Messina, the walls and hanging gardens of Babylon, the labyrinth of Crete, and the pyramids of Egypt. To these is often added the Parthenon at Athens, which, as you have seen, was decorated by the carvings of Phidias. End of chapter 107.
Chapter 108 of the Story of the Greeks. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Matthew Nerger. The Story of the Greeks by H.A. GUERBER. Chapter 108. The Battle of Ipsus. Demetrius, having failed to take Rhodes, now passed over into Greece, hoping to overthrow Cassander. But the other kings, growing afraid of him, agreed to help the ruler of Macedon. They therefore collected a large army and forced Demetrius to stop and fight them all at Ipsus, in Asia Minor. Here, just 20 years after Alexander's death, his generals met in a great battle. Seleucus, it is said, brought a number of fighting elephants, such as Porus had used, which added much to the confusion and fierceness of the struggle. Antigonus, the father of Demetrius, was slain, and Demetrius himself was defeated and driven to Ephesus. The Athenians, who had been his friends and allies as long as he was prosperous, now basely deserted him. They declared themselves his enemies and made a law whereby anyone who spoke well of him or tried to make peace with him should be put to death. The Battle of Ipsus decided the fate of Alexander's kingdom. It was now divided into 4 principal parts. Ptolemy remained master of Egypt, and his family reigned there many years, until under Cleopatra, the last of the race, the country fell into the hand of the Romans. Seleucus and his descendants, the Seleucidae, had the Persian Empire, or Syria and the land between the Indus and the Euphrates. The capital of this empire was first Seleucia, near Babylon, later Antioch, which became a rich and well-known city. Lysimachus was given the kingdom of Thrace, which, however, soon passed into other hands, and Cassander remained master of Macedon. As for Demetrius, although he had lost the kingdom at the Battle of Ipsus, he soon managed to conquer another. In his anger at the Athenians, he first marched against them and besieged them in their own city. The Athenians were frightened, for they knew how well they deserved punishment. But they resisted as well as they could, and the siege dragged on for several months. At the end of this time there was no food left in the city, and the people suffered greatly from hunger. Finally they were obliged to yield, and Demetrius rode into Athens in triumph. End of chapter 108. Chapter 109 of the Story of the Greeks. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Matthew Nerger. The Story of the Greeks by H.A. GUERBER. Chapter 109. Demetrius and the Athenians. The Athenians trembled with fear when they saw the stern expression on Demetrius's face as he entered their city. This terror became still greater when he ordered all the principal citizens to assemble in the public square. None of the Athenians dared to disobey, and they were in no wise reassured when the conquering army surrounded them, each soldier holding an unsheathed sword in his hand. Demetrius now sternly addressed the citizens, who fancied that every moment would be their last. He reproved them harshly for their ingratitude and desertion, and told them that they deserved death at his hands. But he ended his speech by saying that he preferred to show his power by granting them forgiveness rather than by killing them. Then he went on to tell them that, knowing how much they had suffered, he had sent supplies of grain to every house, so that when they were home they should not find their wives and children starving. The sudden reaction from their great terror proved almost fatal to the Athenian citizens, but when they recovered their breath, the air was rent by a mighty shout of joy in honor of their kind conqueror. Although Demetrius was as generous as he was brave, his end was very sad. After a long life of continual warfare, and after conquering and losing Macedon, he fell into the hands of his rival and enemy, Seleucus, who kept him in prison as long as he lived. About this time a new trouble befell Macedon and Greece. This was an invasion of the Gauls, who came sweeping down from the mountains into Greece in order to rob the temple at Delphi. A second time, however, the temple escaped, thanks to a terrible thunderstorm, which filled the superstitious minds of the robbers with dread. In the sudden darkness the Gauls fell upon each other, as the Persians had done in the days of Xerxes, and fought so desperately that many were killed. The Greeks, remembering former victories, now made up their minds to strike a blow in their own defense. They collected an army, and defeated the invaders so severely that Brennus, the leader of the Gauls, killed himself in despair, while his followers withdrew to a province in Asia Minor, which from the Gauls was called Galatia. End of chapter 109. Chapter 110 of the Story of the Greeks. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Matthew Nerger. The Story of the Greeks by H.A. Gerber. Chapter 110, The Achaean League. While the generals and successors of Alexander were busy trying to crush one another, most of the Greek towns, left to their own devices, had become small republics. But instead of forming a union, they became so jealous that they began to quarrel and even to fight among themselves. As the quarrels became more bitter, two parties or leagues were formed, which, from the two most important provinces at that time, received the names of Achaean and Aetolian. The Achaean League was made up of 12 small towns in Peloponnesus, and was under the leadership of Aratus, son of Sicyon. When a child, Aratus had seen his native city in the hands of a tyrant. His father, who was a patriot, had made a bold attempt to free the city, but had failed, and lost his life. Aratus, who was but 7 years of age, heard that his father and all his family had been slain, and knew that the tyrant would try to kill him too. As he was too weak to defend himself, he sought refuge in the house of the tyrant's sister, where no one would be likely to seek for him. This woman, touched by the child's trust, hid him cleverly, and, when all danger was over, sent him to some friends, where she paid for his board, and had him carefully brought up. As Aratus was patriotic, he was anxious to finish the work which his father had begun. At the age of 20, therefore, he assembled a few comrades, entered Sicyon, called all the lovers of liberty to his aid, and drove away the tyrant without shedding any blood. The town, thus freed, joined the Achaean League, of which Aratus soon became the leader. This office was elective, and no one was expected to fill it for more than a year, but Aratus was so much loved that he was chosen leader 35 years in succession. At this time, Greece and Macedon were under the rule of Antigonus Gonatas, son of Demetrius, for this man had conquered for himself the second kingdom which his father had lost. But now Aratus and the Achaean League refused to obey him, so he marched down from Macedon to restore order. To prevent his advance, and to hinder his getting even as much as a foothold in the peninsula, Aratus wanted to capture the fortress of Acrocorinthus, which barred the Isthmus of Corinth. This undertaking was very difficult, because the fortress was perched upon a rock so high and steep that it was almost impossible to climb it. A traitor, Diocles, however, offered to show Aratus a way to climb this rock, provided that he should receive a certain reward. Although general of the Achaean League, and one of the greatest men of his day, Aratus was far from being rich, and, in order to obtain the required sum, he had to sell all he had, and even pawn his wife's few jewels. Then, in the midst of the darkness, one rainy night, Diocles led the Achaean soldiers along a steep path, which they had to climb in Indian file. He brought them safely and unseen into the fortress, where they killed most of the Macedonian sentinels and put the guards to flight. As soon as the key of the Peloponnesus had been thus daringly won, most of the other towns in the peninsula joined the League, and the Achaeans gained such victories that Antigonus Gonatas fell ill and died of grief. The Achaean League became stronger and stronger, and although Sparta and a few other cities remained neutral, most of the small towns were freed from their tyrants. Such was the importance of the League that the Roman ambassadors once came to ask for its aid to suppress the pirates who infested the neighboring seas. This help was cheerfully given, and the Achaeans entered into a treaty with the Romans. They little suspected, however, that the city whose name was then almost unknown would in less than 100 years become strong enough to subdue them and be mistress over all Greece. End of chapter 110.
Chapter 111 of the Story of the Greeks. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James Simenc. The Story of the Greeks by H.A. GUERBER. Chapter 111. Division in Sparta. While the Achaean League was doing its best to restore Greece to its former power, Sparta had remained inactive. The Spartans had changed greatly since the days of Lycurgus. They no longer obeyed his wise laws, and instead of being brave and frugal, they were greedy, lazy, and wicked. One of their kings was named Leonidas, but he was in no way like his great namesake, the king who had fallen at Thermopylae. Indeed, he married an Eastern wife, and to please her assumed all the pomp and led the idle life of an Eastern king. His fellow king, on the other hand, was such a miser that he heaped up great treasures. When he died, his wife and mother were said to have more gold than the city and people together. The miser king was succeeded by his son, but this young man's sole ambition was to restore Sparta to its former condition. His name was Agis. He lived like the Spartans of old, practiced all the virtues of his ancestors, and was frugal and brave in the extreme. To restore Sparta, real Spartans were needed, but in counting them over, Agis found that there were only about 700 of the old stock left. The first move was to restore equality. For that purpose, all the money and land would have to be equally divided. So Agis began by persuading his own mother and grandmother to give up their wealth. Leonidas did not like the plan of equality, and soon openly opposed it, although his son-in-law Cleombrotus sided with Agis and upheld it. But the people were eager for the new division, which would make them all equal as of old. And they were so angry with Leonidas for his resistance that they rose up against him and proposed to depose him by reviving an old law which forbade the ruling of a king who married a foreign wife. Leonidas had time to flee the temple of Athene, and when the ephors called him to appear before them, he refused to do so, because he feared for his life. As such a refusal was a crime, the ephors said he should not reign any longer, and named Cleombrotus king in his stead. Leonidas, who had led a selfish, pleasure-loving life, was now forsaken by everyone except his daughter, Chilonis, who gave up her husband and the throne in order to console her unfortunate father. She kept him company in the temple, cared for him and amused him, and when her husband begged her to come back, she answered that her place was rather with her unhappy father than with her prosperous husband. When it became known that the Spartans were plotting to kill the unhappy Leonidas, Agis helped him to escape, and Chilonis followed him into exile. The Achaean League, which just then was very strong, now sent an army across the isthmus to attack the Spartans. The latter sallied forth under the leadership of Agis, who proved such a skillful general that he not only won a great victory, but also drove the Aetolians out of the peninsula. During the absence of Agis, many of the richest Spartans who had not yet given up their property refused to do so, and when urged by Cleombrotus to obey, they revolted against him and recalled Leonidas. Cleombrotus had only time to take refuge in the same temple where his father-in-law had once found shelter. Here he was soon joined by his wife, Chilonis, who, ever faithful to the most unhappy, came thither to comfort him. Leonidas was so angry that he would probably have treated Cleombrotus with the utmost severity had not Chilonis fallen at his feet and begged him to spare her husband's life. Her tears touched her father, and he granted the favor she asked, declaring, however, that Cleombrotus should go into exile. In spite of her father's entreaties to remain with him, Chilonis insisted upon accompanying her husband. She gave Cleombrotus one of their 2 children, clasped the other to her breast, and left the city, proudly walking at her husband's side. End of chapter 111.
Chapter 112 of the Story of the Greeks. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Matthew Nerger. The Story of the Greeks by H.A. Gerber. Chapter 112. Death of Agis. When Agis heard of the changes which had been taking place in Sparta during his absence, he quickly went home. On arriving to the city, he found the party of the rich so powerful that he could not oppose them, and was even forced to seek refuge in a temple, as Leonidas and Cleombrotus had each done in turn. His wife, Agiotis, forced by illness to stay at home, could not show her love by following him there, but a few faithful friends went with him, and kept guard over him. Their watchfulness was needed, because Agis slipped out of the temple every night to go to the bath and refresh himself. It happened, however, that 2 of these friends were false. They basely took the bribes offered by the ephors for information about the king, and told them that he left the temple every night, and for what purpose. Thus advised, the ephors surprised the little party the next night, and thrust Agis into prison. He was tried and condemned to death by order of Leonidas, and thus died when only 22 years of age, after having vainly tried for 3 years to bring the Spartans back to their former simplicity and virtue. Leonidas, not content with killing Agis, gave the widow Agiotis to marriage to his son Cleomenes, who was a mere boy, several years younger than she. Agiotis soon won great influence over the young prince, and told him so much about her dead husband that he tried to follow the example of Agis in everything. When Leonidas died, Cleomenes succeeded him, and thanks to the teachings of his wife, was both great and virtuous. He drove away the ephors, who are rich and corrupt, and then distributed all the property equally among the people, as Agis had planned. When Aratus heard of the reforms made by Cleomenes, he began to fear that Sparta would win back her former power and again try to lord it over the rest of Greece. To prevent such a misfortune, he decided to attack the Spartan king while he was too young to excel in the art of war. He therefore advanced with a good army, but, to his surprise and dismay, he was completely defeated by the young king. Several of the smaller towns now showed a desire to leave the Achaean League and join Sparta, so Aratus became more eager than ever to suppress her rising power. In his eagerness he forgot all caution, and even asked help of Antigonus Doson, king of Macedon, the successor of Antigonus Gonatas. This ruler owed his surname of Doson, who will give, to a bad habit of promising all kinds of gifts to his followers, promises which were never kept. Antigonus Doson was only too glad to send a Macedonian army into Greece, and not only garrisoned the fortress on the Isthmus of Corinth, but also sent troops on into the Peloponnesus. End of chapter 112. Recording by Matthew Nerger. Chapter number 113 of the Story of the Greeks. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Matthew Nerger. The Story of the Greeks by H.A. Gerber. Chapter 113, The War of the Two Leagues. The Achaean and Macedonian armies now met the Spartans at Silesia in Laconia, where the latter were badly defeated, and Sparta fell into the enemy's hands. Antigonus was so proud of his victory that he burst a blood vessel upon hearing the news, and died shortly after. Before he closed his eyes, however, he had the satisfaction of driving Cleomenes away from Greece into Egypt. There the young king fell upon his sword, after killing his children, rather than become a slave. Tyrants were now allowed again in many of the Greek cities, in spite of the remonstrances of Aratus, who learned only too late that the Macedonians had come into the Peloponnesus merely for the purpose of making themselves masters of the country. Aratus' eyes were open. He saw that all his efforts were in vain, and that, owing to his own imprudence, Greece would never again be free. In his grief, his presence of mind quite forsook him. He did not know what steps to take in order to undo all the harm he had done. The Aetolians now became the champions of freedom, and marched against the Achaeans, whom they defeated. In their distress, the Achaeans once more begged the Macedonians to interfere, and sent troops into Greece. The contest which followed is known as the War of the Two Leagues, and lasted for some time. In the beginning, the Macedonian king allowed Aratus to take the lead, and followed all his directions. But, growing weary of this subordinate part, he finally poisoned the Achaean leader, and became head of the league himself. When the Spartans and Aetolians, who had joined forces, found that the Achaeans and Macedonians were likely to prove too strong for them, they also began to look around for allies. As the fame of the rising city of Rome had reached them, they finally sent thither for the help they needed. The Romans were then rapidly extending their territory, and hoped soon to become masters of the world, so they were glad to help the Spartans against the Macedonians, who were already their enemies. They therefore speedily came to the Spartans' aid, set fire to the Achaean and Macedonian ships, and defeated their armies so sorely that Philip was obliged to beg for peace and to give them his son as a hostage. The Spartans, having thus freed themselves from the yoke of the Achaean League, now fell into far worse hands, for they were governed by a tyrant named Nabis, a cruel and miserly man who, in order to increase his treasure, often had recourse to vile stratagems. He had made a cunning instrument of torture, on purpose to obtain money from anyone he wished. This was a statue, the exact image of his wife, clad in magnificent robes. Whenever he heard that any man was rich, Nabis used to send for him. After treating him with exaggerated politeness, the tyrant would gently advise him to sacrifice his wealth for the good of the state. If his guest refused to do so, Nabis would invite him to visit his wife, and lead the unsuspecting man close to the statue. This was made so as to move by a system of cunningly arranged springs, and as soon as the victim came within reach, the statue's arms closed tightly around him. The terrified guest, caught in an irresistible embrace, then found himself drawn closer and closer, and pressed against sharp points and knives hidden under the rich garments. It was only when the tortured man had solemnly promised to give up all he owned that the tyrant Nabis would set him free. But if he resisted, he was killed by slow torture and allowed to bleed to death in the statue's embrace. End of chapter 113. Recording by Matthew Nerger. Chapter 114 of the Story of the Greeks. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Matthew Nerger. The Story of the Greeks by H.A. GUERBER. Chapter 114. When Aratus died, the principal man in the Achaean army was Philopoemen, a brave and virtuous young man. He was patriotic in the extreme, and so plain and unassuming that no one would have suspected his rank. On one occasion, when he had reached the dignity of general, he was invited to dine at a house where the hostess was a stranger to him. When he came to the door, she took him for a servant on account of his plain clothes, and curtly bade him go and split wood. Without saying a word, Philopoemen threw aside his cloak, seized an axe, and went to work. The host, on coming up a few minutes later, was horrified to see his honored guest cutting wood, and was profuse in his apologies for a mistake which only made Philopoemen laugh. When Philopoemen heard how cruel Nabis was, he wanted to free Sparta from his tyranny. So he entered the town at the head of an armed force of men, confiscated the treasures for the benefit of the public, and drove Nabis away. The Spartans were at first very grateful to the Achaeans for freeing them, but they soon began to feel jealous of their power, and again rose up in revolt against them. This time Philopoemen treated the Spartans with the utmost severity, even razing the walls of the city, which were never rebuilt. Philopoemen was far-sighted enough to see from the beginning that the Roman alliance would prove bad for Greece. He soon discovered that the Romans intended to subdue the country, and in order to do so most easily were trying to make the people quarrel among themselves. All his efforts were therefore directed towards keeping peace, and for a time he was quite successful. But the Romans, seeing no other way to bring about a quarrel, at last bribed the Menicians to revolt. In the course of the war, Philopoemen was led into an artfully arranged ambuscade, and was taken in chains to Messina, where, notwithstanding his gray hair, he was exposed to the jeers of the common people. After thus humiliating him, They led him to the place of torture, but when he heard that his army had escaped from the ambush, he fervently cried, "I die happy, since the Achaeans are safe." This only hastened the end of the brave patriot, who had been called the last of the Greeks, because he was the last to try and maintain his country's independence. The Achaeans soon after took the town of Messenia, stoned all Philopoemen's murderers on his tomb, and carried his ashes to Megalopolis, his native city, where they were buried with great pomp. End of chapter 114.
Chapter 115 of The Story of the Greeks. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Story of the Greeks by H.A. Garber. Greece, a Roman province. For centuries the Greeks had been in the habit of assembling at Corinth every 3 years for the celebration of the Isthmian Games in honor of Poseidon, god of the sea. Here, as at Olympia, there were races, wrestling and boxing matches, and contests in verse and song. And as usual the prizes were simple crowns of olive leaves, which were considered far more precious than silver or gold. In 196 BC, not only were the Greeks present at this celebration, but there were also many Romans who wished to witness the games. The Greeks were then particularly happy, because the war of the 2 leagues seemed to be ended, and the country was at peace. In the midst of the festival, Quintius Flamininus, the Roman consul, mounted the orator's block and proclaimed that the Roman army had just won a great victory over the revolted king of Macedon, and that the Greek states were now indeed free. These tidings were received with such a tumult of joyful cries, it is said, that a flock of birds that were flying overhead fell to the earth, stunned by the shock of cheers which rent the air. This joy, however, did not last very long, for the new-won freedom of Greece existed in name only. As soon as the Romans had completed the conquest of Macedon under its last ruler, Perseus, they prepared to annex Greece also. Their first move was to accuse the Achaeans of sending aid to Macedon. Under this pretext, 1,000 leading citizens were seized and sent to Rome to be tried. Here they were kept in exile for many a year, longing to go home and fuming against their detention. When they were finally allowed to return, they were so embittered that, as the Romans had foreseen, they soon stirred up the revolt among the Achaeans. Aemilius Paulus, the conqueror of Macedon, then marched into Greece and swept over the whole country. He took the city of Corinth and burned it to the ground, after carrying off many of its most precious works of art to adorn his triumph. Such was the ignorance of the Romans at that time, however, about all matters of art, that the sailors who were to carry these treasures to Rome were warned by the consul to be careful, as they would have to replace any article they had damaged or lost. The Romans then placed garrisons in the principal Greek towns, and the country became a mere province of Rome, under the name of Achaia. Thus ends the history of ancient Greece, which, though so small, was yet the most famous country the world has ever known, the country from which later nations learned their best lessons in art, philosophy, and literature. End of chapter 115. End of The Story of the Greeks by H.A. Garber.